Which is a better reply for black after 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3, 2 f6, or 2 knight c6? Incorrect. This is Damiano's defense, which draws its name from the 16th century, where it should remain. It's a horrible defense of the king-pawn. It impedes the development of black's king-knight a2 g8 and e8 h5. White can thereafter deter black from castling kingside by positioning his king-bishop on c4, guarding g8, the square black's king winds up on when castling kingside. You're not allowed to castle into check. And there are more reasons to avoid this move, but the point has been made. Play something else. Correct. This is the best way to protect the king-pawn. It develops a new piece toward the center, incurs no weaknesses, and doesn't entail any insoluble problems. It's the linchpin of most double king-pawn defenses. If it fails, black has to declare Chapter 11. Which is a better reply for black after 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3, 2 d6, or 2 bishop d6? Correct. This is an excellent bolstering of the king-pawn that brightens the way for the development of the queen-bishop. But it's not an active response, and it comes with a problem, the slight hampering of the king-bishop. After 2 d6, it can move only to the square e7. Because of the constricted complexion of black's position after 2 d7 d6, white has a good chance to maintain an initiative right into the middle game. But black should still survive, and if he does, he can tell his friends that the name of this beginning, 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3 d6, is Philidor's defense. Incorrect. This defends the e-pawn, but not satisfactorily. The move's chief drawback is that it develops the king-bishop in front of the d7 pawn, obstructing its movement. This is ruinous to black's central coordination and harmony. Moreover, to develop the queen-bishop thereafter, black will either have to advance the dark square bishop for a second time, neither of which is quite palatable in these circumstances. As a rule of thumb, don't retard the movement of center pawns by placing pieces in front of them. Which is a better reply after 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3, 2 queen f6, or 2 knight f6? Incorrect. It's not a good idea to use the queen so early, and for such defensive purposes. Should you have the general do what can be done by the private? That's needless overkill and a total waste of resources. On f6, the queen is highly subject to attack. Both white's queen-knight, via the path b1, c3, d5, and the queen-bishop, by going to g5 if protected by a knight on f3, can fire away at Her Majesty. The move queen d8 f6 also refuses black's king-knight use of f6. All in all, this premature move of the queen leads black down the wrong path. Correct. This is not a defense. Rather, it's a counterattack that works out pretty well. The moves 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3, knight f6 signify Petrov's defense, or the Russian game. And even though black apes white through the first two moves, he will not continue to do so if white follows 3 knight f3 takes e5. Instead, he intends to drive back the knight with 3 d7 d6. After the anticipated retreat, 4 knight e5 f3, black plans to take back the king-pawn, 4 knight f6 e4. Which is a better response to 1 e4 e5 2 f4, 2 d5, or 2 d6? Correct. This is the defining thrust for the Falkbeer counter gambit. 1 e4 e5, 2 f4 d5, which is an attempt to steal white's thunder in the king's gambit. If white takes black's queen pawn, 3 e4 takes d5, black has the option of advancing his king pawn, 3 e5 e4, or taking white's f-pawn, 3 e5 f4, both of which produce a satisfactory game. Actually, white can go wrong big time here. If he instead replies by capturing black's e-pawn, 3 f4 takes e5, black has the humiliating rejoinder 3 queen d8, h4, check, and white is in deep trouble. It's time for a game of checkers. Incorrect. This response is too passive. It secures the king pawn, but clogs the a3 f8 diagonal, hindering the development of the king bishop. And with black's king bishop so obstructed, white is free to pursue active aggression without immediate fear of counterattack along the a7 g1 diagonal, which the king bishop often achieves by being stationed at c5. After 2 d7 d6, the dark square bishop can't get to c5 without an additional move of the d-pawn, and that requires a probable loss of time. Which is a better reply to 1 e4 e5 2 f4, 2 e takes f4, or 2 queen h4 check? Correct. Taking the pawn results in the king's gambit accepted, which is a perfectly viable way to continue. In exchange for ceding the pawn, white gets activity and the chance to create an ideal pawn center with an eventual d2 d4. But first he must ward off the oncoming queen check at h4 by 3 knight g1 f3. Then white's ready for business. Incorrect. Such a queen check is mere bluster, for white can rebuff the intrusion by 3 g2 g3. Black will have to withdraw the queen, losing a tempo in the bargain. Not all checks are good moves. Like other moves, they must be considered in relation to their merits and demerits, and their degree of relevancy. The category of a move, whether it's a check, a fork, a threat, etc., is irrelevant. What is relevant is whether or not a move works in the situation at hand. You know, a move by any other name would smell as sweet. After 1 e4 e5, 2 bishop b5, which is a better response? 2 c6 or 2 knight c6? Correct. White's move pins the d7 pawn. But this is not serious. Black can punish white's last transgression, 2 bishop f1 b5, by 2 c7 c6, compelling the bishop to waste time flying to safety. This counter also breaks the pin while assailing d5. Now if white withdraws the bishop to c4, black can stick another pawn in its face, 3 d7 d5. After the expected 4 e4 takes d5, c6 takes d5, the bishop will have to move again. White might follow with 5 bishop b5 check, leading to a new pin after the reply 5 knight b8 c6, But at this point, black has garnered a tangible advantage. An ideal classical pawn center. Pawns at d5 and e5. Incorrect. Bringing the knight to c6 is a missed opportunity. The pawn should go there instead, to gain time on the b5 bishop. What's happened is that after 2 bishop f1 b5, knight b8 c6, both sides have made inaccurate second moves, which more or less cancel each other out. White will most likely continue 3 knight g1 f3, and through an unusual move order, the players will have transposed back into a standard opening known as the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. The usual move order is 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3, knight c6, 3 bishop b5. Sometimes 2 wrongs make the Ruy Lopez by transposition. After 1 e4 e5, 2 queen h5, which is a better response? 2 queen e7 or 2 g6? Correct. This reply is the least of the evils, but it shows that black is alive to white's threat. From h5, the queen attacks 3 pawns on h7, f7, and e5, and only 2 are defended. But nothing protects the e5 pawn, so the merit of positioning the black queen at e7 is that it upholds the menaced king-bishop and that it places the queen in a slightly more exposed spot. In your own games, if you are ever in this position and need to guard the king-pawn, do it with the queen-knight from c6. It props the e-pawn without jamming up anything. Don't play the queen defensively to e7 until it becomes necessary, such as when white actually threatens mate at f7. Incorrect. Panic is the motivation for this move. White's queen invades, and black's knee-jerk reaction is to drive it back. But this loses at once to 3 queen h5 takes e5 check, forking the king and the lame rook in the corner. Black should resign because the rest is not pretty. Generally, I advise students to be careful about playing this move, g7, g6, to flog the enemy queen, because even when it's correct, it's usually laden with associated weaknesses and problems. After 1 e4 e5, 2 queen h5, which is a better response? 2 knight f6 or 2 knight c6? Incorrect. This is one of the cases where the player is thinking only of his own moves. Black sees the chance to menace white's queen by knight g8 f6, but he hasn't considered the reason for the entry of white's queen, to win the pawn on e5. That's why bringing out the queen-knight first is the right way to go. Curiously, as far as blunders go, this one, 2 knight g8 f6, isn't too bad, for after 3 queen h5 takes e5 check, bishop e7, black follows by castling kingside, and may be able to muster additional threats to white's queen. Black's play is probably not worth a pawn, but it's worth something. As a rule, whenever you win material, you must be alert to counterattack, because your pieces tend to be a little disjointed, the result of having taken the material. So steal that pawn if it seems to work, but afterward don't fall back on your laurels, else in the end you may have nothing to celebrate. Correct. In some quarters, white's opening is known as the terrorist attack, and the best way to grapple with it is this defense of the king pawn. Once the e5 pawn is held up, black can respond to the enemy queen by scaring it back with knight g8 f6, or possibly g7 g6. And if white follows by threatening mate with 3 bishop f1 c4, black guards f7 with 3 queen d8 e7, and then drives back white's queen on the next move. Sometimes you have to be patient. After 1 e4 e5, 2 d4, which is a better response? 2 d6 or 2 e takes d4? Incorrect. Defending e5 with the d-pawn is much too acquiescent here. If after 2 d7 d6, white then exchanges pawns, 3 d4 takes e5, d6 takes e5, he will be in a position to trade queens most unfavorably for black. After 4 queen d1 takes d8 check, king e8 takes d8, black loses the right to castle. His king ends up on an open file in the central shooting gallery with his forces in disarray. You don't need this kind of aggravation. Correct. Taking tends to be more active than guarding, and it's often the way to keep or steal the initiative. When you take something, the other side has to take back just to maintain the material balance, which usually costs a tempo, and if he doesn't take back, you probably get to keep whatever you've taken. After black captures white's queen pawn, 2 e5 takes d4, white might naturally recapture with his queen. 3 queen d1 takes d4. This places Her Majesty smack in the middle, where black can attack her. In having to move the queen to safety, white loses time, and if he's not careful, even the initiative. After 1 e4 e5, 2 d4, which is a better response? 2 bishop b4 check, or 2 knight c6? Incorrect. This is development, but at a price. White answers the threat with a pawn block, 3 c2 c3, and black will have to expend a tempo getting the bishop out of attack. And here's black's dilemma. He never really answered the threat to his king pawn, so that now he has two things to worry about: the e5 pawn and the b4 bishop. To salvage both, he has to retreat the bishop to d6. This deals with the previous two problems, but it assumes a new one, for on d6, the bishop obstructs the d-pawn. If black can't move the d-pawn, he has trouble coordinating his forces. See how one problem can spawn another. Even when you solve it, the solution may entail further problems that eventually spiral into a losing game. Correct. This is an acceptable defense, for not only does it guard e5, it counters by also attacking d4. So white must react, and suddenly we have the give and take of a real game. The best move here is the active 2 e5 takes d4. But if there's a second possibility, it would be to defend the king pawn by developing the queen knight to c6. White would have plenty of choice nonetheless, such as pushing the d-pawn, exchanging it for the e-pawn, or defending it by developing the king knight to f3, but black would still be afloat. After 1 e4 c5, 2 d4, which is a better response? 2 c takes d4, or 2 b6? Correct. With this move, black annihilates white's plan to create a united pawn center by destroying the d-pawn. No matter how white replies, black comes away with two central pawns to white's one. This puts white in a predicament. He can bring out the queen early, 3 queen d1 takes d4, which loses time to the assault of black's queen knight, 3 knight b8 c6. He could defer taking the pawn back until after he's developed the king knight, 3 knight g1 f3, which gives black a free hand to pilfer the initiative. Or he could offer a pawn by 3 c2 c3, hoping to obtain play outweighing the value of his sacrificed pawn. It's a gamble, and black's odds are looking good. Incorrect. This move is illogical. Why guard the c-pawn when black's idea in the Sicilian is to exchange the c-pawn for white's d-pawn? But worse than being overly defensive is that black is going to lose the very thing he attempted to protect. After 2 b6, 3 d4 takes c5, b6 takes c5, white expropriates a pawn by 4 queen d1 d5, a fork that menaces the queen rook as well as the spoiled c5 pawn. Guess which one black is going to save and which one he's going to abandon. After 1 e4 c5, 2 knight f3, which is a better response? 2 knight f6 or 2 d6? Incorrect. This is not blunderous, and it's only slightly inferior to d7 d6. The difficulty with it is that white can now chase black's knight by 3 e4 e5. Black's knight has d5 at its disposal, which certainly isn't fatal, though white can still maintain pressure against the steed with various threats, such as c2 c4 or knight b1 c3. These possibilities ensure that white keeps his initiative, and so d7 d6 is preferable. It inhibits the advance of white's king pawn so that it can't freely move up to attack the knight once it goes to f6. Correct. The advance d7 d6 is slightly better than the suggested alternative, knight g8 f6. The pawn move does two important things. It clears the diagonal for the development of the queen-bishop, and it guards the square e5, holding white's king-pawn in place. Once the king-pawn's movement is restricted, black can start aiming the guns at it. It's harder to hit a moving target. The only problem with the move d7 d6 is that black gives up the option of moving his d-pawn to d5 in one move. This is not at all pertinent, and d7 d6 is quite normal in the Sicilian defense. After 1 e4 c5, 2 knight f3, which is a better response? 2 d5 or 2 knight c6? Incorrect. The two-square push of black's queen pawn is too aggressive and premature at this juncture. White responds by taking on d5 to draw out black's queen, and then white's queen knight comes to c3, attacking the queen and compelling it to move again. After 2 d7 d5, 3 e4 takes d5, queen d8 takes d5, 4 knight b1 c3, and after black's queen then moves to safety, white rips open the game with 5 d2 d4, deriving a huge initiative. Correct. The development of black's queen knight to c6 is both natural and effective. From c6, the knight reinforces one of the crucial concepts behind the Sicilian defense, to influence the central squares d4 and e5. The move doesn't really have a downside. After 1 e4 c5, 2 knight c3, which is a better response? 2 knight c6 or 2 knight f6? Correct. Nothing wrong with bringing out the queen knight here, but there's something wrong with developing the king knight. It wastes time. Black's placement of the queen knight at c6 is logical and consistent. It's in line with black's intended dark square play against d4 and e5, which can be emphasized further by flanking the king-bishop at g7 if the situation allows black to follow through. Incorrect. This development is not as good because of timing. Black hasn't properly assessed the waste of time and the discombobulation to his position that ensues from the advance of white's e-pawn. Especially bad for black is that the f6 knight is now denied access to d5 and e4 because of the placement of white's queen knight at c3. The only safe place for the harried f6 knight is g8, back to where it came from. How could black avoid this unpleasantness? By first guarding e5, especially by moving the queen pawn to d6 before developing the king knight to f6. After 1 e4 c5, 2 f4, which is a better response? 2 e6 or 2 e5? Correct. The single square advance is the appropriate retort in this position. It sets up the counterattacking d7, d5, challenging white's e-pawn. And if white then takes on d5, e4 takes d5, black recaptures with the e-pawn, e6 takes d5, clearing the c8 bishop's diagonal of development. Incorrect. Black's reply weakens d5, d6, and f5, but it's actually a little tricky. At first glance, it looks like a mistake, for it seems white can take black's e-pawn for free. 3 f4 takes e5. But there's a sucker punch coming, and it's 3 queen d8 h4 check, forking king and king pawn at e4. White can rope-a-dope, however, with the solid building move 3 knight g1 f3, which guards h4 against incursion. And if black in turn gets greedy, 3 e5 takes f4, white constructs a formidable-looking front with 4 bishop f1 c4. The situation suddenly has transposed into a very favorable king's gambit setup, where black has essayed the irrelevant thrust c7, c5. This works in the Sicilian defense, where the opening started, but not in this variation of the king's gambit, where the opening wound up. After 1 e4 knight f6, 2 e5, which is a better response? 2 knight g8 or 2 knight d5? Incorrect. Such a retreat can't be right. It's as if black has not played a move for 2 moves. Better is to keep the knight in the game by 2 knight f6 d5. Also bad is 2 knight f6 e4, which results in the piece getting trapped by 3 b2 b4. This takes away the knight's rescue square c5 and leaves it vulnerable to the threatened attack d2, d3. Of course, moving the menaced knight to either g4 or h5 doesn't offer any solace, for white's queen then appropriates it for free. Correct. The knight should fight for its share of the center with 2 knight f6 d5. True, the piece can then be driven to b6 by 3 c2 c4, but that's the way this defense has to be played. Black tries to provoke white into overextensive pawn advances that can't be adequately supported. Black gets what he wants when white's pawns prove to be weak, and he becomes harried trying to safeguard them. White gets what he wants when black runs out of space, with his pieces stepping on each other's toes because of the same fearsome pawn marauders. Who is more correct? This is unclear, but it's going to be a fight right down to the end, and that has a kind of beauty. After 1 e4, e6, 2 d4, which is a better response? 2 bishop b4 check, or 2 d5? Incorrect. Don't pass bad checks like this one. Instead, pass on them. Not all checks are good. This one costs black time, for after 3 c2 c3, black will have to withdraw his bishop. Perhaps you feel, big deal. Maybe black does have to move his bishop again, but what has white gained? At least 2 things, both of which he gets for free: the fortification of his d4 pawn and a clear diagonal, a4 d1, for the queen's entry into the festivities on the queen side. These are the little things that decide games. None of them seem to mean much when considered individually, but as you accumulate them, they can assume a very great advantage. In fact, as a playing credo, it's hard to do better than following the maxim, little things matter. Correct. The opening phase is not just about development, it's also about the battle for the center. Often the way to win this fight is to fashion a powerful pawn front. Since white initially builds a pawn center after 1 e2 e4, e7 e6, 2 d2 d4, black naturally attempts to garner a piece of the action with the counter 2 d7 d5. If white's e-pawn then takes black's d-pawn, black can create the same setup as white by taking back with his e-pawn 3 e6 takes d5. At this point, black should be able to vie on equal footing. After 1 e4 c6, 2 d4, which is a better response? 2 e5 or 2 d5? Incorrect. On the surface this may look terrible because it seems to lose a pawn. 3 d4 takes e5. But it actually doesn't, for black has a forking queen check at a5 that regains the pawn. Nonetheless, the whole concept is wrong, for after 2 e7 e5, 3 d4 takes e5, queen d8 a5 check, 4 knight b1 c3, queen a5 takes e5, 5 knight g1 f3, black has to move his threatened queen once again. The result is that black gets his pawn back, but loses too much time in the process, and that's a no-no in the opening. Correct. This is the right move. If white takes black's d-pawn, 3 e4 takes d5, black's c-pawn takes back, 3 c6 takes d5. and that's the main purpose of black's first move, to support the advance of his d-pawn to d5. The opening of the a5, d8 diagonal is purely tangential, though it's true that in many variations of the Caro-Kann defense, black does place his queen at c7. The basic purpose of the Caro-Kann defense, 1 e4 c6, is safety and security, plus the hope that white will overreach himself trying to penetrate black's defensive front. After 1 e4 d6, 2 d4, which is a better response? 2 d5 or 2 g6? Incorrect. This is a waste of time, for black could have moved the d-pawn here on move 1, and white will gain even more time after exchanging pawns and developing the queen-knight toward the queen 2 d7 d5, 3 e4 takes d5, queen d8 takes d5, 4 knight b1 c3. Are there ever occasions when you should move a pawn twice to reach a square you could have occupied in one move? The answer is yes. Do it when you realize that you made a mistake the first time, and that it's still necessary or desirable to correct the error. Or do it when your opponent blunders, so that suddenly moving the pawn a second time becomes advantageous, even though it may not have been prudent on the previous move, before your opponent's lapse. Correct. This is a logical move, preparing to fianchetto the bishop at g7, where it attacks along the a1 h8 diagonal. On this diagonal is the key square e5. Black wants to control this point so that white's king-pawn doesn't begin a steamrolling advance against black's king-knight once it comes to f6. After 1 e4 d5, 2 e takes d5, which is a better response? 2 queen takes d5 or 2 e6? Correct. Since white has just taken black's d-pawn, it makes sense to take it back, keeping the material situation in balance. Although bringing the queen out early entails some risk, black can hold his own with the proper use of counterattack and tactical threats. For example, after 2 queen d8 takes d5, 3 knight b1 c3, queen d5 a5, black is often able to develop his queenside pieces quickly. His rook might then exert considerable influence along the d file. White still keeps his opening move initiative, but black too takes an active part in the merrymaking. Incorrect. This turns the game into a gambit, where black winds up sacrificing a pawn, 2 e7 e6, 3 d5 takes e6, bishop c8 takes e6. But what exactly does black get for his sacrificed pawn? It turns out that he gains only one extra move for development. A good rule of thumb is that you need 3 tempi to make an opening pawn sacrifice meaningful, and black's offering here falls short of the mark. A better opening gambit is to play 2 knight g8 f6 instead. Now if white wants to hold on to his pawn, he has to play the unproductive 3 c2 c4. After 3 c7 c6, 4 d5 takes c6 to ensure keeping the pawn, 4 knight b8 takes c6, followed by a stab with the king pawn, e7 e5. Black comes away with real compensation. He has a lead in development, a strong central pawn at e5, and the chance to play against the weaknesses at d3 and d4. These are substantive things, and they render this gambit 2 knight g8 f6 far more reasonable than the one proffered by 2 e7 e6. After 1 d4 d5, 2 c4, which is a better response? 2 knight f6 or 2 e6? Incorrect. Black's knightly development actually loses control of d5 and then e4. Now when white takes the queen pawn, 3 c4 takes d5, black probably recaptures with his knight. Taking with the queen loses at least a tempo to knight b1 c3. After 3 knight f6 takes d5, black has lost two defenders of e4. The pawn that used to be on d5, it's been destroyed, and the knight that used to be on f6, it's been diverted. White will soon follow with the advance of the king pawn, and black forfeits time and central control. Correct. This fortifies the d-pawn and opens the a3 f8 diagonal for black's dark square bishop. If white should take black's pawn, 3 c4 takes d5, black is in position to take back, e6 takes d5, maintaining a strong pawn in the middle. By keeping a pawn on d5, black exercises sway over e4, dissuading white from moving his e-pawn to king 4. After 1 d4 d5, 2 c4, which is a better response? 2 c6 or 2 bishop e6? Correct. Black's pawn advance indicates the Slav defense. 1 d4 d5, 2 c4 c6. Black retains a solid presence in the midsection. For if an exchange takes place, black can recapture with the c-pawn. 3 c4 takes d5, c6 takes d5. And in some situations, with black's queen-bishop pawn in place at c6, black gets to take white's c-pawn. d5 takes c4 with the chance to hold on to the captured pawn by b7 b5. The slight drawback to this move, c7 c6, and it's practically irrelevant, is that c6 becomes blocked and unavailable to the queen knight. Incorrect. Black's bishop development is strategically suspect. It blocks the e-pawn, don't develop minor pieces in front of center pawns, and upsets the central equilibrium. Piece control is not the same as pawn control. Pawns are stable building blocks that are not easily removed. Pieces are sensitive creatures which can be driven off by advancing pawns. After 3 c4 takes d5, bishop e6 takes d5, 4 knight b1 c3, knight g8 f6, 5 f2 f3, black is unable to stop the advance of white's king pawn. He's renounced pawn control of the center and must accept the consequences. After 1 d4 f5, 2 e4, which is a better response? 2 f takes e4 or 2 g6? Correct. White offers the Staunton gambit. 1 d4 f5, 2 e4. Black should take it. 2 f5 takes e4, and then play carefully, whether white continues 3 f2 f3 or 3 knight b1 c3. Particularly sensitive are the lines leading to black's king and the square h5. But with proper play, black can hold his own. Incorrect. This is disastrous for black. White snaps off the pawn, 3 e4 takes f5, and if black mindlessly takes back, 3 g6 takes f5, white issues a fool's mate. 4 queen d1 h5 checkmate. This shows what can happen if black passively responds with unnecessary protections when more active responses, such as captures, are possible. This doesn't mean that by capturing an assailant you successfully defend the position, but the one thing that's true about eliminating an enemy assailant is that after it ceases to exist, it can no longer attack you. After 1 d4 g6, 2 e4, which is a better response? 2 knight f6 or 2 d6? Incorrect. This develops the king-knight, but too provocatively. White's e-pawn will advance on the knight, 3 e4 e5, forcing it out of position. And after 3 knight f6 d5, the knight can be kicked once again by 4 c2 c4. White steals several tempi at black's expense, so black's development, knight g8 f6, actually loses time. Correct. The advance of the d-pawn is in order here, for by it black takes steps to deter white's e-pawn from its aggressive intentions, e4, e5. With e5 more secure, black can then develop his king-knight to f6 without fear of harassment. Of course, black doesn't have to play either of these moves. On move 2, he could instead play bishop f8 g7, completing the fianchetto, which is a natural development at this point anyhow. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 knight c3, which is a better response? 2 d6 or 2 d5? Incorrect. The one-square advance of the d-pawn is not at all bad, but here it's not quite as good as the two-square push. After 2 d7 d6, play will probably transpose into the Pirc defense, with 3 e4 g6. Obviously this is innocuous, but white still keeps his first move initiative. This is what happens when players essay set opening repertoires. They play the same first few moves practically regardless what their opponents do. The result is they could overlook opportunities that materialize from an unusual move order. In the end, they arrive at their planned formation, but have no idea what they've missed or could have gotten. Correct. The double d-pawn advance is right on the mark here. With one stroke, black firmly establishes himself in the center and counters white's own central ambitions. And since white has already blocked his c-pawn, he forfeits the best way to increase pressure against black's d-pawn, the advance c2, c4. Now, to obtain play in the middle, white must toy with the idea of a gambit, 3 e2 e4. But with his eyes open, black can survive to tell the tale. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 knight f3, which is a better reply? 2 knight g4 or 2 e6? Incorrect. This is a mindless move. When in the opening you move the same piece a second time, you need a good reason. Here there is no justification for it. Black's move doesn't build his game, and it threatens nothing. Time is precious at the game's start. With each move you should be trying to activate a different piece, so that by move 10 or 12 your entire army is mobilized. Black's knight move accomplishes nothing, but it's worse than that. for the intrusion 2 knight f6 g4 undoes what black did on his first move. That is, black's commencement move, 1 knight g8 f6, tried to guard e4 to restrain the advance of white's e-pawn. But his second move, 2 knight f6 g4, cedes control of e4, which clashes with his first move. So white pushes ahead 2 squares on the e-file, 3 e2 e4, obtaining an ideal pawn center. Also injurious is the knight on g4 itself. It can be driven away practically at will by h2 h3. Black's whole enterprise turns out to be a pointless waste of time. Correct. This is the good play here. It controls d5 and opens a diagonal line for the development of the king-bishop. The advance e7 e6 is also a very flexible move. After white's natural third move, 3 c2 c4, he has no way of knowing what reliable defense black intends to adopt. It could be the Queen's Indian, 3 b7 b6, the Bogo Indian, 3 bishop f8 b4 check, the Benoni, 3 c7 c5, or the Queen's Gambit, 3 c7 c5. It's good to keep your opponent guessing, because he might guess wrong. After 1 d4 e6, 2 c4, which is a better reply? 2 g6 or 2 bishop b4 check? Incorrect. Moving the g-pawn here is useless and time-wasting. The f8 bishop already has a channel for development, the a3 f8 diagonal. If it were black's intention to flank the dark square bishop, he should have held back the e-pawn and played g7 g6 on his first move. So black's second pawn move is illogical. Another problem is the combination of the 2 pawn moves, e7 e6 and g7 g6. If you play them both, you create a severe weakness at f6. Once both the e and g pawns have been moved, the square f6 is deprived of pawn protection for the game's remainder. Black might be able to contend with this frailty, but why should he put himself into such a predicament? If you want to develop the king-bishop, just move either the e-pawn or g-pawn, one or the other, not both. Correct. A natural and good move. This invasion works because white cannot block the check with the c-pawn. If he could put the c-pawn in the way, black would wind up losing time by virtue of having to withdraw the bishop to safety. If the check has a drawback, it's that it might lead to the early exchange of dark square bishops, which means that black winds up trading his king-bishop. Generally, it's better to retain the king-bishop because of its ability to strengthen the king side against onslaught. But this is only a small point, and as the game develops, it could become irrelevant. After 1 d4 g6, 2 c4, which is a better reply? 2 bishop h6 or 2 bishop g7? Incorrect. It doesn't attack the center. And where does it lead? White trades bishop, 3 bishop c1 takes h6, knight g8 takes h6, and black's king-knight lands on the edge of the board. And what about black's dark squares on the king side? Once his king-bishop is traded off, what remains to uphold the dark squares? Heir? You shouldn't go to all the trouble of flanking a bishop just to trade it. Doing so wastes time and incurs needless weaknesses. As a rule, don't allow your fianchettoed bishop to be swapped without a fight or without gaining some kind of advantage in the transaction. Correct. This is the correct placement. From g7, the bishop oversees the center, while exerting long-range power on the a1-h8 diagonal. Usually, if in the beginning you have the choice between influencing the center or a different region, and you can't decide which is better, go with the center. At g7, the bishop hits at the hub. At h6, it observes the outer limits. The choice is clear. After 1 d4 c5, 2 d takes c5, which is a better reply? 2 e6 or 2 e5? Correct. The single-squared advance is the preferred continuation. A path is opened for the f8 bishop to recapture on c5, while black fights for control of d5. Should white now attempt to retain the pawn at c5 by the risky 3 b2 b4, black counters with the undermining 3 a7 a5, and if white follows with 4 c2 c3, trying to protect the b-pawn, black trades pawns 4 a5 takes b4, 5 c3 takes b4, and scores with 5 queen d8 f6. This puts the screws to the white rook at a1 and ensures the gain of material. It's one thing to take the pawn at c5, 2 d4 takes c5, and quite another to try to steal it, 3 b2 b4. You can take it, but let black take it back, unless you can clearly see your way through the complications. Incorrect. This double advance is too aggressive and too weakening. First off, the e-pawn itself becomes a target, so much so that white could actually try 3 b2 b4 and 4 bishop c1 b2. Why is this treacherous push, 3 b2 b4, a possibility here after a two-square advance of the king-pawn after 2 e7 e5, and not after a one-square advance, 2 e7 e6? Because with the king-pawn on e5, white can gain time by attacking it, 4 bishop c1 b2, which diffuses black's efforts to regain his c-pawn. Suddenly, black has a number of tasks to fulfill, and that's the justification for 3 b2 b4. The other problem with 2 e7 e5 is the concomitant weakening of d5. After 2 e7 e5, white can debate control of d5 by placing his c-pawn on c4, developing his queen-knight to c3, and flanking his king-bishop at g2. This would not be as reasonable after the more logical 2 e7 e6, a one-square advance of the king-pawn. Does this mean that moving the king-pawn for black just one square ahead is always better than moving it 2 squares ahead? Of course not. The answer does not imply a general rule, but rather a specific response to a particular position. Nothing more, nothing less. After 1 d4 f5, 2 c4, which is a better reply? 2 h6 or 2 knight f6? Incorrect. This is a bad pawn move. It weakens the square g6, which had already been softened by black's first move with the f-pawn, and it enfeebles the e8 h5 diagonal. White can now forge ahead with a powerful 3 e2 e4, threatening a queen check at h5 that results in mate. 4 queen d1 h5 check, g7 g6, 5 queen h5 takes g6 checkmate. If black insists on moving another pawn on move 2, let it be the king-knight pawn, 2 g7 g6, or the king pawn, 2 e7 e6, both of which enable the dark square bishop to come into play without jeopardizing the safety of black's king. Correct. The natural response. Black develops a new piece and emphasizes his control over e4. This is what effective opening moves do. They integrate pawn and piece placements into an overall conception, where each unit exhibits harmonious function. Here, black has moved 2 soldiers, and they work together to guard e4. Another nice point to knight g8 f6 is that it strengthens the e8 h5 diagonal by guarding h5. This prevents white's queen from using h5 to wreak havoc. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 c4, which is a better reply? 2 g6 or 2 d5? Correct. This flank development is perfectly feasible. It prepares for the fianchetto of the king-bishop at g7, where it can observe the middle from afar. Black also gets the option of following with the king's Indian defense, 3 knight b1 c3 d7 d6, which involves a 1-square advance of the d-pawn, or the Gruenfeld defense, 3 knight b1 c3 d7 d5, entailing a 2-square d-pawn advance. It's also possible to transpose into a Benoni defense by moving the c-pawn, c7 c5, instead of the d-pawn. So 2 g7 g6 leaves black in good shape. Incorrect. This thrust may seem reasonable and similar to the Gruenfeld, but it turns out to be a little premature. The problem arises in the center after white captures black's pawn, 3 c4 takes d5. However, black takes back, whether with the queen or the king-knight. White eventually will gain time and build a classical pawn center with e2 e4. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 c4, which is a better reply? 2 knight c6 or 2 e6? Incorrect. This move is totally acceptable, but it requires that you be a bit of a trailblazer and take uncharted chances. Black must be vigilant against the advance d4 d5, which is certainly on white's agenda because of the space and time it could gain under optimal conditions, if everything goes white's way. The entire defense hinges on the capability of black to find a decent counter to this advance d4 d5, making sure the queen-knight can still be efficacious. Another way to look at it is whether the advance d4 d5 causes more problems than it incurs. Will white gain territory and drive black's pieces into the sea? Or will white overextend himself and engender serious weaknesses in his own camp by moving his center beyond the ability of its support force to protect it? Because knight b8 c6 demands real accuracy to succeed, and because it's quite easy to go wrong amid the likely complications, it's more to the point to play 2 e7 e6 instead. Correct. The low-key push 2 e7 e6 is the safe and sound way to go. Black retains plenty of flexibility, and backed up by the serviceable e6 pawn, the option of converting to a double queen-pawn system by countering with d7 d5. The time to deviate from standard opening lines is after you've learned what they are. In your own play, try to employ the main opening ideas until you've assimilated enough to experiment and to innovate. Not until you've acquired some expertise should you seek to find yourself in a personal style. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 c4, which is a better reply? 2 d6 or 2 a6? Correct. The central pawn move, d7 d6, is definitely preferred over its side counterpart, a7 a6, if only on general principles. Specifically, a diagonal is opened for the c8 bishop, and the square e5 is placed under observation, as should a few chess fanatics. Later on, the d-pawn can be the prop for a strike in the middle with either the c-pawn, c7, c5, or the e-pawn, e7, e5. Incorrect. What can be said in defense of this move, a7, a6? It doesn't attack a center square, and it doesn't develop a piece. But this is not to say that it's devoid of any virtue. If white plays incautiously, the opportunity may arise for black to advance the b-pawn to b5, protected by the a6 pawn. From b5, the pawn might menace a further advance to b4, driving away a knight positioned on c3. Once the c3 knight moves, it abandons control of e4, and if there's a white pawn on this square, black might be able to seize it for free. That's a lot of contingency, but none of these things are unreasonable, so white must be watchful. He shouldn't laugh off such a beginning, a7, a6, as being without punch. Just because a move starts off innocuous doesn't mean it can't be made virulent by the proponent's opportune tactics and by the opponent's illogical plans. After 1 d4 c6, 2 c4, which is a better reply? 2 d5 or 2 b5? Correct. When you're not sure, be sure of the center. This central move, 2 d7 d5, announces the Slav defense of the queen's gambit declined. If white trades pawns, 3 c4 takes d5, c6 takes d5, the opening becomes the Slav exchange. Black's position is satisfactory because he is able to keep a pawn in the center at d5. And if white doesn't inaugurate an exchange, c4 takes d5, there's always the chance that black might be able to take a pawn himself. He might be able to capture white's queen-bishop pawn, d5 takes c4, and then bolster the captured booty by b7, b5. This becomes plausible because black's queen-bishop pawn is already in place at c6, ready to uphold the b-pawn's sudden advance once it becomes desirable. Incorrect. This rejoinder doesn't work. After 3 c4 takes b5, c6 takes b5, 4 e2 e4, white has a chess player's dream. 2 aligned pawns smack in the middle. Meanwhile, black has a chess player's nightmare. No center and no prospects of getting one. Throw in the unpleasantry of having to waste time to guard the hanging b5 pawn, note that white's f1 bishop assails it, and black's second move, b7, b5, quickly loses its luster. After 1 d4 b6, 2 c4, which is a better reply? 2 bishop b7 or 2 d5? Correct. Having begun his fianchetto, black should follow through and complete it by 2 bishop c8 b7. From b7, the bishop asserts itself along the a8 h1 diagonal. On this diagonal are 2 critical central squares, d5 and e4. Further down the line are 3 focal kingside squares, f3, g2, and h1. This is the vicinity of white's king once it castles kingside. The trick for black is to keep the diagonal open while maintaining the bishop's effective poise. Incorrect. The advance d7, d5 should be delayed. Funny thing is that black could have essayed this push, d7, d5, on move 1, before white's c-pawn was stationed on c4. To play d7 d5 on move 2, however, is to invite 3 c4 takes d5, queen d8 takes d5, 4 knight b1 c3. After black withdraws his queen to safety, white advances the king pawn to e4. The entire sequence is forced, and at the end, white has 2 central pawns and black has a headache. The advantage is huge, and it rests with white. After 1 c4 e5, 2 knight c3, which is a better reply? 2 knight f6 or 2 c5? Correct. The move of the knight gets the distinctive nod of approval. A new piece is activated. The center squares e4 and d5 are placed under the microscope, and a pathway to castling is starting to become manifest. It's hard to get more out of an opening move. Incorrect. The move of the c-pawn should be held in abeyance. The idea is to clamp down on white's center, hindering the envisioned advance of the d-pawn. But the hole black creates at d5 is a heavy price to pay. White will converge on the hole by flanking the king-bishop at g2. Then white will shift his attention to d4. This he can do by moving the king-pawn to e3 and developing the king-knight to e2. Eventually, white will push the queen-pawn up to d4 and get the best of both worlds, d4 and d5. After 1 c4 e5, 2 knight c3, which is a better reply? 2 bishop b4 or 2 knight c6? Incorrect. The move of the bishop is new and experimental. The idea of 2 bishop f8 b4 is to chop off the c3 knight and reduce white's control of the central light squares d5 and e4. But what happens if the knight counters by going to d5? Then the bishop must move again, probably to c5. If black wishes to avoid this retreat, he should delay the bishop's development by instead playing 2 knight g8 f6. If white then flanks the king-bishop 3 g2 g3, the movement of the bishop to b4 makes more sense. In that event, black can answer white's knight c3 d5 by taking the knight. Knight f6 takes d5 instead of moving the bishop. After this exchange, black's prospects are excellent. Let's get back to the concept of new. The word new here doesn't state or connote that the move 2 bishop f8 b4 has never been played in the history of chess. In fact, you might have played it last weekend. Instead, it implies, and even this is a judgment, that the move does not appear in the standard chess literature as a recommended possibility in this situation. There could be many reasons for this. The move could be original, or maybe it's been around for a long time and no expert has seriously played it or analyzed it for public consumption. Or possibly the move once had great currency and has since fallen into desuetude. Therefore, it's been dropped from the library of chess concepts. These and other reasons, however, don't give the full picture. They merely address the creative aspects of individual moves. We're also alluding to strategies. Understand that when the term new is used, it's probably not so much the move itself that's considered innovative. Rather, it's more likely that the word new refers to the subsequent plan of play that justifies and supports a particular move's inventiveness. The new might very well refer to the 4 or 5 moves that follow, and not the actual specific play itself. Correct. Tradition supports this knightly reaction. The attack on the square b4 is purely coincidental. The real point of knight b8 c6 is to lay siege to the central dark squares d4 and e5. This development also conforms to the perhaps exaggerated principle knights before bishops. This maxim recommends that in developing the minor pieces on a particular side of the board, whether on the queen side or on the king side, one should first bring out the knight and then the corresponding bishop from that side. The reason being essentially that bishops have more options than knights, and it makes sense to delay their development a bit until the situation clarifies and the bishop's best square becomes known. This decision is easier to make for knights, for in most cases their best placements tend to be at bishop 3, c3 and f3 for white, c6 and f6 for black. So, by developing a knight fairly early, one is not necessarily conveying important information or taking as confining a stand. But of course the maxim knights before bishops is only a generality, with plenty of exceptions. If you follow it too closely, you're bound to get into trouble. Indeed, sometimes it's quite logical to develop a bishop ahead of its knightly colleague, especially when it works. After 1 c4 e5, 2 knight c3, which is a better reply? 2 bishop c5 or 2 queen h4? Correct. This is the preferred development, bringing out the minor piece instead of the queen. Unless black is playing a total novice, the attempt to mate by the scholar's mate, which relies on the premature development of the queen, is doomed to fail. At least the bishop move has its own utility. From c5, the bishop begins its trench warfare against d4, a consequential central square. Moreover, as soon as black engages his king-knight, he's ready to castle. Is there a potential drawback to the move? Only one, and that is the possibility of white subsequently countering the bishop with the queen pawn, d2, d4, driving it away. But this is not in the immediate cards, and chess is not a card game. Incorrect. Don't do this, even though the move menaces white's c-pawn. Early queen deployments often backfire, because the queen can be harassed by little pieces. And this is what happens after 3 knight g1, f3, queen h4 takes c4, 4 knight f3 takes e5. Pawns have been merely exchanged, but white gains ground in the center, obtains 2 center pawns to black's 1, and continues his threat to the opposing queen. White's advantage is assured. After 1 c4 c5, 2 knight c3, which is a better reply? 2 d6 or 2 g6? Incorrect. You can't go too wrong moving a center pawn, d7, d6, but here the advance comes out second best. To confirm this, just take a look at the pawn skein in the middle after the push 2 d7, d6. The f8 bishop's natural developing diagonal, a3, f8, thereafter is obstructed by pawns at g7. This could be achieved at once, starting with move 2 by advancing the g-pawn. And by not yet moving the d-pawn, black retains the option of moving it later to d5 with a single thrust by advancing it 2 squares. Play it now to d6, and it takes 2 moves for the queen pawn to reach d5, which wastes a tempo. Correct. Here is where the side pawn wins out. After moving the king-knight pawn, 2 g6, black naturally intends to fianchetto the king-bishop at g7, where it attacks d4. Concerted pressure on d4 will also come from the c-pawn, c7, c5, and the queen knight, knight b8, c6. The plan of developing the forces around a key central square is typical. What about black's d-pawn? Where will it go and when? It will move to either d6, backing up the dark squares, or to d5, creating a full center. But later, not yet. After 1 c4 c5, 2 knight f3, which is a better reply? 2 d5 or 2 knight f6? Incorrect. This advance, d7 d5, is premature, and black finds himself in a quandary after white takes the pawn, 3 c4 takes d5. If black takes back, 3 queen d8 takes d5, white gains a useful tempo by developing the queen knight, 4 knight b1 c3. And if black delays the recapture by introducing the king knight, 3 knight g8 f6, white has the surprise rejoinder 4 e2 e4. Black is then unable to seize white's e-pawn because of the forking queen check at a4, gaining black's hapless knight. Correct. Developing the king knight here, 2 knight g8 f6, is a stellar idea. This prepares the advance of black's d-pawn and takes steps to castle kingside. Even if white continues 3 knight b1 c3, black may follow with the d-pawn's advance, 3 d7 d5, in perfect safety. Note that after 2 knight g8 f6, 3 knight b1 c3, d7 d5, 4 c4 takes d5, knight f6 takes d5, it would be undesirable for white to exchange further. 5 knight c3 takes d5, queen d8 takes d5. Although black's queen winds up in the center, by trading off his queen knight, white has lost the best piece with which to dislodge the queen when it's on d5, the queen knight. Thus, black's queen would be well situated in the center, and the trade of knights, initiated by white in this analysis, would be unwise. After 1 knight f3, knight f6, 2 g3, which is a better reply? 2 c6 or 2 g6? Incorrect. There's nothing terribly wrong with 2 c7 c6, but why play it here? The main reason to do so would be to support the advance of black's d-pawn to d5, but black can immediately push the d-pawn 2 squares up without further protection, 2 d7 d5. And if afterward white hits at the center with 3 c2 c4, black can then choose to move the c-pawn to c6, propping the queen pawn. If white doesn't assail d5, black is free to pursue his own plans, which may indeed include c7 c6 if black deems this move valuable. The point is that time is precious in the opening of a chess game, and you shouldn't play unnecessary moves. Life and games tend to be too short for that. Correct. This 2 g7 g6 is the more relevant move here. Black prepares a fianchetto, to be followed by kingside castling. True, black is temporarily copycatting white's moves, but the symmetry probably can be broken favorably at an appropriate subsequent time. Right now, at least until black castles, this plan is sound and worthy of pursuit. After 1 knight f3 d5, 2 g3, which is a better reply? 2 c5 or 2 d4? Correct. This 2c7 c5 is a logical progression. In many flank openings, and in most queen-pawn games as well, the players tend to rely on the advance of the c-pawn to drum up queenside and even centrally related activity. First, the c-pawn advances. Then the knight usually develops behind it. Here, after moving the c-pawn up 2 squares, c7, c5, and bringing out the queen knight, knight b8, c6, in back of it, black will be in position to support the movement of the king pawn to e5, obtaining a formidable center. Incorrect. Another move with the d-pawn here is uncalled for. Black may think he's gaining space because the further up the board you move your pawns, the more room you have behind them. But by advancing the d-pawn for a second time, black actually opens the a8 h1 diagonal for white's light square bishop. This piece will wind up at g2, capable of sustained fire across the board along the supreme light diagonal, the one that divides the board in half. Keep black's queen pawn at d5, and white's flanked bishop is somewhat neutered. There's an additional problem associated with black's overextensive pawn advance, d5, d4. It places the d-pawn closer to the opponent, where white's pieces can more easily get at it. Black's aims therefore are served better by the other choice, moving the c-pawn to c5, which coincidentally supports a d-pawn push if that should become necessary or attractive. After 1 g3 e5, 2 bishop g2, which is a better reply? 2 d6 or 2 d5? Incorrect. This d7 d6 is scaredy-cat chess. Black is afraid of making a statement by placing his queen pawn on d5, where it's further out in the world, more capable of being attacked. If you play with such fear, you'll probably undertake nothing, which usually results in your opponent having a free hand. See how long you last then. But there's actually nothing horrifying about d7 d6. It fortifies the e-pawn while clearing a line for the c8 bishop. It's just that it's a little passive in a game that thrives on aggression. Correct. This, d7, d5, is the more active of the two moves. With one stroke, black sets up an ideal pawn center, ready to combat white's wing attack in the middle. Black obtains open lines, more space, and promising chances. Nor is he overextended, for his center pawns can be upheld without much trouble. In fact, each is capable of advancing with the other's support. If anyone has to prove anything at this point, it's white. He must demonstrate that black's center is fallible. If he can't, black comes away with the advantage and the ability to dictate the terms of play. After 1 b4 e5, 2 bishop b2, which is a better reply? 2 knight c6 or 2 bishop takes b4? Incorrect. Black's defense of the e-pawn, knight b8 c6, fails to the direct prod 3 b4 b5. If black then plays his knight to d4 to shield the attack on the e-pawn, white simply kicks the steed with 4 e2 e3. The white b-pawn is then guarded by the f1 bishop. Black therefore can't take it, and the d4 knight must move away. On his fifth move, white captures the e-pawn for free. 5 bishop b2 takes e5. If black were intent on guarding his e-pawn, he should try d7 d6 on the second move, and not knight b8 c6. No enemy pawn can drive off the d6 pawn, but a knight on c6 is vulnerable to the thrust b4, b5, and accordingly unreliable. Correct. The capture 2 bishop f8 takes b4 is the correct way to proceed. In turn, white gets the king pawn, 3 bishop b2 takes e5. But it takes white's queen bishop 2 moves to do this, whereas black's king bishop can capture the white b pawn in just 1 move. This connotes the loss of a tempo. Black uses this extra move to mobilize his king knight and to castle. What does white acquire for the forfeited initiative? He hopes that having a central pawn majority of 2 pawns to 1 will ultimately offset the loss of time. So it's another instance of both players having pros and cons to their positions, and whoever follows through more logically will probably emerge in the catbird seat, like real life. After 1 b3 e6, 2 bishop b2, which is a better reply? 2 knight f6 or 2 bishop c5? Correct. The viable move is 2 knight g8 f6, developing the king knight toward the hub. On f6, the knight also breaks the line of the b2 bishop, providing shelter for the square g7. Once the knight is in place, the f8 bishop is ready to come out, but not before, for otherwise the g7 pawn hangs. After the f8 bishop's activation, black can prepare for business by castling. Here we see a good example of the knights before bishops rule. By developing the king knight before the king bishop, black avoids a nasty problem, the need to worry about the g7 pawn's defense. Incorrect. A blunder is a blunder, and this is the status of 2 bishop f8 c5. It leaves the g7 pawn hanging, capturable for free, to white's b2 bishop. To add insult to injury, after taking on g7, white's bishop is positioned to eat the cornered black rook at h8. How do you steer clear of such mistakes? There is no way to prevent them altogether, but you might make one last careful check before you play your intended move. Simply ask yourself, have I missed anything? Or, does my opponent have any checks or captures that I haven't considered? These questions are not foolproof, but you'll be surprised how many times you'll avoid losing errors by merely posing a directive question.